For 30 nights, Britain burned. From London's docks to the factories of Coventry, the Luftwaffe promised annihilation and came terrifyingly close to delivering it. But when the smoke of the first month finally cleared, Winston Churchill spoke words that reshaped a nation's soul and defined Britain's will to live. June 1940. Britain stood alone. Across the English Channel, France had fallen in a matter of weeks, swept aside by the lightning advance of the Wehrmacht. The continent's capitals had been occupied, armies shattered, governments fleeing or capitulating. Hitler's troops now looked across the Channel at a green island that remained defiant, an island standing between Nazi Germany and total domination of Western Europe. The threat was no longer theoretical. It was imminent, a shadow that stretched across every quiet town and bustling city. Hitler, confident in the superiority of his Luftwaffe, launched Operation Adelrangriff, Eagle Attack, a campaign designed to destroy the Royal Air Force and clear the skies in preparation for Operation Skyline, the planned invasion of Britain. Intelligence reports, though often incomplete, hinted at a massive air campaign. German bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes were already massing over northern France, while radar stations along the British coast tracked every movement in silence, unseen by the public. On the home front, civilians began to feel the tightening grip of wartime reality. Gas masks were issued, small metal boxes containing the promise of survival, or the illusion of it. Families drilled under dim lamplight, practicing blackouts, ensuring that no window would betray a house to enemy bombers. Underground shelters, some hastily built, others centuries old, became a quiet refuge from the looming storm. Children clutched maps of air raid shelters as parents explained the unfamiliar language of sirens, gas, and blackout regulations. Every street, every lane, seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the city itself held its breath. Winston Churchill, newly ascended to the office of Prime Minister, delivered speeches that would become etched into history. His words were urgent, defiant, and stirring. In July 1940, he spoke of a nation preparing for a struggle unlike any other. "We shall go on to the end, we shall never surrender." Yet, behind the resolve, few could imagine the scale of destruction that the skies would bring. For many Britons, the air war remained an abstraction, a distant echo of a conflict raging on the continent. The Royal Air Force, a slender line of defense, was preparing for a battle that would decide the fate of the nation. Fighter Command squadrons, Hurricane and Spitfire units, trained relentlessly, pilots racing against time to master new tactics, climb rates, and formation flying. Radar operators in the chain home stations tracked every movement over the channel, providing critical early warnings that might mean the difference between life and death. Down in the factories, engineers and mechanics labored to repair damaged aircraft, often working through the night, knowing that every plane ready to take off could save a city, a street, or a family from fire. And then, on the night of September 7, 1940, the first waves descended. 348 German bombers crossed the channel under the cover of darkness. London's skyline, a patchwork of chimneys and rooftops, became a target for destruction. Fires erupted across the city, anti-aircraft batteries sputtered into life, illuminating the smoke-choked night with flashes of desperate defense. For the first time, Britain's civilians would witness the grim reality of total war from above. The Blitz had begun. The storm overhead was more than a military campaign. It was a test of endurance, courage, and the human spirit. Across the city, families huddled in shelters, listening to the wail of sirens, the thud of bombs, and the distant drone of engines. For the island nation, the coming months would define its identity, its resolve, and the very meaning of survival under fire. Britain, isolated but unbroken, braced itself for the longest and most harrowing winter in its history. The night of September 7, 1940 was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, London was subjected to a relentless storm of fire and steel. For 57 nights, the Luftwaffe returned, often in waves of 300 to 400 bombers, each laden with high explosives and incendiaries. The city's skyline, once a familiar patchwork of spires and chimneys, became a canvas of flame and smoke. Docks along the Thames erupted in explosions. Warehouses, factories, and rail yards were obliterated. Hospitals, water mains, and entire blocks of civilian housing disappeared under firestorms that roared like molten rivers through the streets. The sensory onslaught was overwhelming. The sharp scream of Stuka dive bombers cut through the night, followed by the deafening detonation of bombs striking the streets below. The orange glow of fire reflected off the Thames, illuminating the faces of thousands of Londoners huddled in shelters, their ears ringing from the blasts. Smoke choked the air, thick and acrid, turning the city into a nightmarish labyrinth where familiar streets became treacherous rubble-strewn corridors. Firefighters waded into infernos that reached 1,000 degrees, their leather and canvas uniforms offering little protection as they battled to keep the flames from consuming entire neighborhoods. Amid this chaos, human resilience emerged in unexpected acts of courage. On the rooftop of St. Paul's Cathedral, fire watchers risked everything to prevent the historic dome from catching fire. Spraying water from hoses and beating down embers that landed on the roof, their vigilance preserved a symbol of national endurance, even as the city around it burned. On the streets below, ordinary citizens carried on with stubborn determination. A milkman, navigating through rubble and fallen beams the morning after a raid, delivered bottles to residents, refusing to let the rhythm of daily life be extinguished. These moments, small but profound, became the quiet heartbeat of a city under siege. The toll was staggering. Within the first 30 days, more than 6,000 civilians had been killed, and tens of thousands more wounded or made homeless. Families who had been huddled together in darkness now faced the task of sifting through debris, searching for possessions, for loved ones, for some sense of normality. Amid the destruction, the question hung in the air, unspoken but universally understood: how much more can we survive? Even as London burned, strategic targets continued to draw the Luftwaffe's attention. The docks, vital for Britain's supply of food, fuel, and munitions, were repeatedly attacked, crippling transport and straining resources. Rail yards, hospitals, and communication lines suffered repeated devastation. Yet, despite the destruction, emergency services adapted, hospitals improvised, and the government organized evacuation plans and relief efforts on an unprecedented scale. By early October, London was a city reshaped by fire, its population traumatized yet unbroken. The nights had tested every fiber of civilian endurance, every measure of courage and ingenuity. For those who emerged from shelters, the cityscape offered both despair and defiance, a city scarred but standing. The Blitz had begun in earnest, and Britain faced the terrifying reality of modern total war. Survival was a daily, precarious achievement, measured not only in strategic victories but in the resilience of ordinary human hearts. By late September 1940, the weight of the Blitz pressed heavily not just on London streets, but on the nerve center of Britain's defense, RAF Fighter Command. Squadrons were stretched to their absolute limits, flying 3, sometimes 4 sorties a day, chasing shadowy formations of Heinkel 111s and Junkers 88s across the Channel and over the southeast of England. Pilots were exhausted, averaging barely 20 hours of sleep a week, and yet each took to the skies with grim determination, knowing that the survival of an entire nation rested on their wings. Some nodded off mid-briefing, leaning on maps and charts, only to be woken by a superior officer's sharp command. Rest was a luxury no longer afforded. Aircraft losses were almost immediate. Hurricanes and Spitfires fell nearly as fast as they could be repaired or replaced. The Luftwaffe's concentrated assaults tested every defensive measure, every tactic developed in months of preparation. Radar stations, the backbone of early warning systems, became frequent targets. The Germans understood their importance and struck repeatedly, but chain-home radar stations were repaired with astonishing speed. wires reconnected, antennas rebuilt, men working through the darkness of night to ensure that Britain could detect every incoming raid. On the ground, crews labored tirelessly. Mechanics, armorers, and engineers moved in dim hangars illuminated by flickering lanterns, stripping engines, replacing wings, patching fuselages, and readying ammunition. The rhythm was relentless. Planes landed damaged from combat, were refueled, rearmed, and sent back into the air, sometimes within hours. These unseen warriors were as essential as the pilots above, their skill and stamina the invisible threads holding the defense together. Winston Churchill, acutely aware of the stakes, visited RAF Fighter Command's 11-group bunker at Uxbridge. Below the surface, the room hummed with tension. Air marshals hunched over plotting tables, moving markers that represented incoming raids, fighter squadrons, and defensive coverage. Charts were scrawled with red ink tracking losses and success rates. Churchill observed the stress etched into every face, the calculation of risk, the pressure of responsibility, and the knowledge that any misstep could mean devastation for the cities below. The Prime Minister understood the symbolic as well as the strategic stakes. The morale of Britain, already battered by nightly firebombings, would crack if the skies could not be held. Despite exhaustion, despite losses, Fighter Command adapted with ingenuity. Squadrons reorganized flight rotations, refined tactics for engagement, and leveraged radar-guided interceptions with increasing precision. Pilots flew low-level attacks to disrupt bomber formations. Hurricanes clawed through the clouds to engage enemy fighters, and Spitfires met them head-on in a deadly ballet of speed and firepower. Every engagement was a test not just of skill, but of endurance, nerve, and sheer human will. By the end of September, a creeping dread settled in the War Cabinet. Reports from intelligence and home-front observers alike painted a grim picture. London burned nightly, civilian casualties mounted, and Fighter Command was teetering at the edge of collapse. The question that haunted every meeting, every decision, was the same. If London falls, does Britain itself begin to fracture? In the shadowed corridors of power, the fate of a nation hung on the resilience of a few thousand exhausted pilots and their tireless ground crews, holding the line in the skies above a city that refused to surrender. September 15, 1940. By mid-morning, the skies over southern England were dark with a mass of 1,500 German aircraft, a coordinated strike of unprecedented scale, the largest air battle the world had ever seen. Fighter Command, already stretched to its limits from weeks of continuous sorties, braced for a confrontation that could decide not just the fate of London, but the survival of Britain itself. Every radar station, every observer post, every airfield from Dover to Croydon was alive with tension. Reports crackled over telephone lines and radio circuits, formations spotted, altitudes noted, headings calculated with exacting precision. In the operations room of 11 Group at Uxbridge, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding oversaw the flow of information like a conductor of an orchestra, each blip on the plotting table representing hundreds of lives in the air. Beside him, Winston Churchill stood silently, eyes scanning the tables, every marker a potential disaster. The Prime Minister leaned close and whispered, a question more of necessity than hope. Are we out of reserves? It was a moment of profound vulnerability. The thin line between triumph and catastrophe hung in the balance. RAF pilots launched every remaining squadron, Hurricanes and Spitfires climbing into a sky thick with bombers and fighters. Dogfights erupted over Kent, Essex, and the Thames estuary, planes weaving and diving, tracer fire cutting streaks across the clouds. Every engagement was a battle of attrition, every success measured in seconds of survival. Ground crews on the airfields who had barely slept watched their aircraft disappear into the morning light, praying that the men inside would return. Below the clouds, London's residents felt the rumble of engines and explosions echo through their homes. Anti-aircraft guns fired intermittently, bright flashes marking defensive action, while fires began to flare in industrial districts. Across the city, families huddled in shelters, listening to the distant drone of combat and the occasional scream of a falling bomber, hearts tight with fear. And yet, amid the chaos, a subtle shift occurred. German bomber streams, meant to crush London's industrial and civilian heart, began to fragment. Squadrons broke off under relentless RAF attacks, formations faltering, coordination fraying. The Luftwaffe's numerical advantage was countered by superior tactics, radar-guided interceptions, and the dogged resilience of exhausted pilots who refused to yield. Victory, if it could be called that, came in inches, measured by planes that returned safely to their airfields and enemy formations driven back across the Channel. Inside the bunker, the mood shifted from dread to stunned relief. Dowding allowed himself a rare, quiet exhale. Churchill, ever the watchful eye of the nation, turned to his aides and made a statement that carried both realism and cautious optimism. "Now is not the end, but it is something." The words captured the fragile nature of survival, the precarious balance of endurance in a city under siege, and the psychological weight carried by those charged with defending it. September 15 became etched in history as Battle of Britain Day, a moment when the skies over England were a battlefield, the fate of a capital, and by extension, the nation, rested in the hands of a few thousand pilots and their tireless ground crews. The night reminded Britain of its vulnerability, but also of its resilience, marking the first glimmer that the Blitz, as relentless as it had seemed, could be resisted. London had not fallen. And in that fragile victory, the determination of an island nation found its steel. By early October 1940, London and cities across southern England were landscapes of fire and ruin. Streets once alive with the hum of daily life were now scarred with craters, smoldering rubble, and shattered windows. Yet amid the destruction, an extraordinary resilience emerged. Communities formed bucket brigades, passing pails of water hand to fight fires small and large. Neighbors dug through debris to rescue possessions, clear streets, or simply comfort one another. The Blitz spirit became more than a slogan. It was a tangible, visible force, a quiet defiance rising from the ashes. The iconic image of St. Paul's Cathedral, its dome encircled by fire, captured the paradox of Britain's ordeal. Around it, the city burned, yet the dome remained intact, a symbol of endurance and hope. Fire watchers, mechanics, and ordinary citizens all played a role in preserving it, knowing that if the heart of London could survive, so too could the morale of its people. The cathedral became a touchstone, a visual testament to the nation's refusal to yield to fear. Even as flames consumed entire neighborhoods, morale was sustained by leadership that understood the psychological stakes. Winston Churchill made personal visits to bombed-out schools, hospitals, and neighborhoods. In one bomb crater, surrounded by shattered brick and twisted metal, he shook hands with citizens, offering words of encouragement. Crowds cheered, not out of ignorance of the devastation, but in recognition of shared endurance. The Prime Minister became more than a figure of authority. He was the embodiment of a nation's defiance, walking among ruins while the Blitz raged overhead, witnessing firsthand the human cost of survival. Children returned to makeshift classrooms, nurses worked through nights in hospitals damaged by bombs, and factory workers repaired equipment necessary for war production. Underground shelters became hubs of community life, where people shared meals, stories, and news from relatives, all under the constant hum of anti-aircraft guns and distant explosions. Despite exhaustion and grief, life adapted, bending around the hardships imposed by the air raids but refusing to break. October 7, 1940, marked a milestone. Britain had officially endured its first full month under the Blitz. Over 30 consecutive nights, thousands had perished, tens of thousands were injured, and hundreds of thousands had been rendered homeless. Yet the nation remained standing, a fragile but unbroken mosaic of courage and endurance. The physical ruins of streets and homes were mirrored by a psychological fortitude that refused to yield. As the first month closed, Churchill prepared a statement for the nation, aware of both the devastation and the triumph of resilience. The streets were scarred, The skyline blackened with smoke, and the air still carried the scent of burning timber. But the people of Britain had endured. In rubble-strewn neighborhoods, through the eyes of firefighters, air raid wardens, and ordinary families, a narrative emerged, one of defiance, determination, and the steady rise of morale that would carry a nation through the darkest winter of its history. For all the horror of fire and destruction, the spirit of Britain was visible in every hand that passed a bucket, every brick lifted, every child returned safely to a classroom, and every glance upward at the steadfast dome of St. Paul's. By early October 1940, London had endured a month of relentless bombing. The streets were scarred, the skyline blackened by smoke, and thousands had perished. Yet amid the rubble, the city had endured. In a private war cabinet meeting, Winston Churchill, his face lined with the weight of command and the knowledge of what lay ahead, allowed himself a rare, unfiltered assessment of the city's resilience. London can take it, and by God, London will give it back. It was not bravado. It was recognition of the extraordinary courage of ordinary citizens, of fire watchers and milkmen, factory hands and nurses, all carrying on amid devastation. He described Londoners as the greatest warriors the city has ever produced, emphasizing that in this new kind of war, civilian endurance was as decisive as any battle fought in the skies. Churchill understood that the story of survival had to be told not only behind closed doors, but to the people themselves. In his October broadcast, he shifted the national tone from caution to pride. The language of warning gave way to the language of moral victory. He praised the unity of civilians and military alike, highlighting that every firefighter, air raid warden, and pilot contributed to a common purpose. The barbarism of the Luftwaffe, he declared, has failed to break the spirit of free people. Each word was deliberate, measured to convey both defiance and reassurance, a reminder that endurance in the face of terror was itself a form of victory. The RAF received particular commendation. Spitfires and Hurricanes, guided by radar and the tireless strategy of Fighter Command, became not only instruments of defense, but symbols of hope. Churchill called them the shining barrier between Europe's darkness and the light still burning here, acknowledging that Britain's survival depended on both the courage in the air and the resilience on the ground. The broadcast was more than a morale boost. It was a framing of the Blitz as a strategic and psychological turning point. Hitler's campaign, designed to crush Britain's will, was now reframed as a moral failure. Churchill's words resonated deeply because they reflected the reality of the nation. London had bent under fire, had felt fear, grief, and exhaustion, but it had not broken. Civilians returned to their routines, firefighters continued to battle infernos, and pilots took to the skies with grim determination. In private and public, Churchill captured the essence of endurance. A city battered, a nation tested, yet resolute. His declaration marked the emotional and symbolic climax of the first month of the Blitz, transforming terror into defiance, survival into pride, and survival into a strategic statement. Britain could and would outlast the storm. By October 1940, the first month of the Blitz had left London scarred but unbroken, and the reverberations of endurance were felt far beyond England's shores. The Luftwaffe, which had hoped to crush British morale with nightly bombardments, found its tactics increasingly unsustainable. German pilots reported staggering losses, with Junkers 88s and Heinkel 111s falling in numbers that could not be easily replaced. Fighter escort shortages, fatigue among crews, and the relentless tenacity of the Royal Air Force began to erode the operational edge Germany had counted on. Accuracy in bombing declined. Fires still raged across districts, but the systematic destruction that had been the Luftwaffe's goal proved elusive. British civil defense measures, from fire brigades to air raid wardens, from improvised communication networks to efficient ambulance responses, had adapted with remarkable speed. Streets that had once been death traps now had coordinated routes for evacuations. Neighborhoods had bucket brigades ready for incendiary bombs, and shelters were maintained to ensure civilians could survive waves of attacks. The human capacity to learn, improvise, and endure transformed London from a vulnerable target into a city that could absorb the shock of repeated raids and rebound each morning. The psychological impact was profound. International observers took note. American newspapers marveled at London's resilience, calling it the miracle of 1940. Headlines emphasized not just survival, but the steadfastness of a civilian population that had endured weeks of continuous terror. These reports shaped global perception of Britain as a nation capable of resisting Hitler's aggression, lending moral and political weight to the Allied cause. In Washington, the endurance of Britain began to influence policy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt watched reports of London's survival and recognized both the symbolic and strategic significance. The reality that Britain could resist the Luftwaffe and that its survival was vital to the defense of Western Europe accelerated discussions over military support. Plans for Lend-Lease aid, still in their infancy, gained urgency. Supplies of aircraft, munitions, and other critical materials were prioritized to ensure that Britain could continue to hold the line, signaling the growing interconnection of domestic endurance and international strategy. For Winston Churchill, the month's outcome confirmed a vital truth. Hitler had failed to deliver a decisive blow. Standing amid bombed-out streets, inspecting the tireless work of firefighters, air raid wardens, and ordinary citizens, he realized that the Blitz had not broken Britain's will. Instead, it had forged a hardened resolve. In private and public remarks, he expressed a conviction that would resonate through history. The enemy had overreached, and the window for a knockout strike had passed. The city's resilience was now a strategic asset, a tangible demonstration that Britain could withstand both physical and psychological assaults, and that the nation's endurance would shape the trajectory of the wider war. The first month of survival had transformed the conflict. Where the Luftwaffe had expected submission, it encountered defiance. Where Hitler had hoped to force Britain to the negotiating table, he found a population rallying around shared purpose. London's streets, battered and blackened, had become a proving ground for endurance, courage, and strategic consequence. And as the autumn nights lengthened, the city, its people, its fighters, its leaders, stood ready, signaling to the world that Britain had endured the first trials of total war and would endure many more. The Blitz did not end with October 1940. Night after night, across London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, and other industrial cities, the raids continued into 1941, leaving behind scorched streets, collapsed homes, and shattered lives. By the time the Luftwaffe finally eased its relentless campaign, more than 43,000 civilians had perished. Yet, remarkably, Britain had never broken. The physical devastation was immense, but it was the spirit of endurance that defined the nation's response. From the rubble arose a profound sense of unity. The shared experience of air raids blurred the traditional lines of class and status, creating bonds forged in fire and smoke. Underground shelters became venues not just for survival, but for community. Neighbors shared meals, stories, and the small comforts that made life bearable. The Blitz spirit entered the national consciousness, a mixture of stoicism, courage, humor, and mutual support that would become emblematic of Britain's resistance. Children carried on with school lessons in improvised classrooms. Workers maintained munitions production, and firefighters, wardens, and volunteers continued their tireless service, embodying the quiet heroism of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Strategically, the consequences were profound. The RAF's dominance in the skies remained intact, and Hitler's hoped-for knockout blow, Operation Skyline, was indefinitely postponed. Britain had survived not only through the skill and endurance of its pilots, but through the steadfast resilience of its civilians, who kept essential services running, maintained morale, and refused to yield to terror. Churchill's early pronouncement, "London can take it, and by God, London will give it back," became more than rhetoric. It was a blueprint for the Allied narrative, a psychological anchor that underpinned propaganda, bolstered morale, and projected confidence to the world. What Britain endured in those first 30 days of fire and destruction became the spiritual foundation of its war effort. It was a nation tested in extremis, learning that courage could emerge in every street, every home, and every heart. From the embers of its cities, Britain was reforged, its endurance, unity, and defiance establishing the moral and cultural backbone that would carry it through the darkest years of the Second World War, and shaping a story of resilience that would echo through history.